There's no place like home, and the Winnipeg Jets have clinched that for round one against the Colorado Avalanche. You can find out how on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. As always, thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, will always be free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, more than anything, we just love and appreciate your wonderful support. Tonight's episode, wowee, the Jets have clinched home ice in round one of the playoffs, and you heard me talk about it the past week. That was a critical outcome because Colorado at home versus on the road, two very different teams. On their own ice, right, they're almost unbeatable, except the Jets just kind of embarrassed them. But by and large, right, general sample size, very tough to beat them on the road. If you asked me if, the Jets could beat them in a 7-game series with Colorado having home ice advantage, it would be a very uphill battle, I'm not going to lie. But the Jets have now taken control of that series, and with the first couple of games being played at Canada Life Center, the vibes are pretty darn freaking slapping good. We're going to talk about how they pulled off this clincher against the Seattle Kraken because they only needed a single point, but they got both. We'll get into that in just a moment. Before we go any further, though, I want to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more because right now new customers can get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 win or lose. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Now, like I said, the Jets only needed a point from tonight's game against the Kraken, but they got two. And honestly, I won't even say that this was a particularly great game. I think, when the Jets play weaker teams like this, sometimes they kind of let off the gas a bit. And I think this was one of those games where, in comparison to the Stars and Avs games, the Jets I wouldn't say that they relaxed or anything, but I do think that, that all-zone pressure that we came to associate with them against the really fast teams in the neutral zone and stuff, they didn't really pressure in the same way. If anything, I felt Winnipeg kind of backed off a bit, sort of gave the Kraken a little more space. And when Seattle had to defend in their own zone, they weren't very good either. I thought that Seattle gave the Jets a ton of space. And so at times you just kind of saw Winnipeg gliding around with the puck, which I don't mind. I'm going to take that all day. A game where you can avoid general injuries and you don't have to expend as much energy while still securing home ice advantage is probably about as good as it gets. Unfortunately, the Jets did concede some sloppy goals. I think the passing in this game and some of the decision-making was probably a little more helter-skelter than we're usually used to. And again, I'm not really going to be all that nitpicky about it because, at the end of the day, I don't want to say that this game was meaningless. It wasn't. But I think most people were kind of like, the hard work is basically done. The Jets just needed a point. However you get it, see it through, and you'll probably be fine. And that's kind of how I viewed this game, right? Like, if they lost or whatever, I don't know that I necessarily was too worried. But I, one way or another, I just wanted them to clinch that home ice advantage. If you lose an OT, don't care. Just get that extra point, whatever you can do. But the Jets decided we'll do it in regulation, and they won 4-3. Like I said, there's some sloppiness here and there. A couple of moments where the Jets did kind of get themselves in some trouble. Neil Pionk had a rough game. There were some, let's just say, some turnovers and stuff that I think he'll probably want to burn from his memory. He is, somebody made a really good point on Twitter about him rushing things, trying to compensate for, perhaps a lack of foot speed and stuff on his end. And you saw he had this one clearance attempt or whatever towards the slot that he tried to, I don't know if he just tried to one time it out of the zone or something. I don't even know what the decision making was there, but it turned into a really ugly turnover. And I'm pretty sure that led to a goal against. So, some sloppiness like that, but otherwise, the Jets were fine, right? They had a couple of shifts where they maybe got pinned a little bit, but overall, Winnipeg wasn't too fussed. They got a power play goal from Toffoli. there was a couple of really nice goals from the top line. Kyle Connor notching a few very shifty ones, including one really nice fake one where he sort of received the puck behind himself and then sort of looked off Grubauer, faking a pass of sorts, like shading his body as if he was going to do that, and instead just went short side near post. And like that, the Jets were pretty much in cruise control. So overall, pretty straightforward game. I don't think that there was anything to be too excited about or too alarmed about. I think it's more the sort of overall picture, right? The Jets are very much in the driver's seat for the postseason. The team finally looks like it's really waking up, and we saw them how they were against two excellent, maybe some of the best teams in the league. They kind of walloped both of them. So, heading into the postseason, I think it was really important to have some momentum. In previous years, the Jets sort of stumbled their way into the playoffs, looking like they were ready for golf more than they were ready for the Stanley Cup run. And this year, that's not really the case. 7-game winning streak, a chance to make it an 8th on Thursday. This is, about as good of a vibes roll or vibes check as you're going to have. And it was a sellout crowd. Maybe not the loudest crowd, but certainly I think most people are pretty enthused about the Jets right now. And even Marshawn Lynch was in the crowd. That was pretty friggin' cool, if I'm being honest. As somebody who watches a lot of football, seeing him in Kraken gear was pretty funny. But, overall, just a really solid game from the Jets. I think this is kind of, at this point, more of a victory lap now. The Jets have done most of the hard work. Despite a stumble, they recovered nicely. They've gotten themselves in good form. And so now it's just keeping up those habits. The only thing that was probably not super great was Morgan Barron took a hit earlier in the game and did come out and did not return. Probably more precautionary, but assuming that he's not ready to go, one of David Gustafsson or Kupari or Cole Perfetti will probably draw in. Really, you could choose most of those guys and really get pretty good performance no matter what. So whoever Winnipeg opts for, I think it'll be fine. I'd love to see Perfetti back in, but I don't know what his role with this team is heading into the playoffs is going to be. We'll see. Otherwise, good vibes. Nikolai Ehlers' goal, a couple of Kyle Connor goals, just generally a fun game. I think everyone can agree that clinching that home ice was really important. Hellebuck got one of the top stars of the evening, which was kind of funny because I felt like, on the goals against, he was basically screened for half of them. So it is what it is. The target beat him cleanly on one thing that wasn't ideal, but I mean, it is what it is, right? You don't really care too much. As long as, like I said, as long as the Jets got the extra point, I thought that was a really critical thing, right? You get the single point, you clinch your playoff spot, and anything else is pretty much gravy, right? I keep saying it's the extra point. It's the main standings point that the Jets needed. They got that. They finished it off in regulation, so, no extra dramas, no needed expenditure of energy, just a nice win. And I think, with everyone kind of bought in on the team, it seems like the vibes are back. And this is one of the rare times where you feel like you're going into the postseason with all the energy and momentum you want because, like I said, previous years we kind of stumbled in. Now we're on a roll. Now the team is ready to go. And I think we're all just ready for the playoffs coming up next week. It sounds like Monday, the 22nd, I believe, at around 8:45 Central is the rumored start time. Not confirmed, but rumored start time. I hate it because I'm on the East Coast, and you know me, it's going to be like 9:45 our my time around here, but we do what we do for the love of the Jets, right? Including late games. So we'll see how it goes, but let's just say I'm looking forward to some playoff hockey. But of course, the Jets do have one more regular season game before they can hang it up and call it quits on the year. On a related note, though, obviously a lot of the recent success has kind of come on the back of the top line suddenly not sucking. And we'll talk about, whether I really believe that. Do I think there are some signs for concern still? Or if this top line really is just straight up cooking? We'll get into all of that in just a moment. Before we go any further, though, I did want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. It's playoff time in the NBA and NHL, baseball's in full swing, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every game. For those of you who are Jets fans, obviously this is like a great time for all of you to cast your playoff bets. Maybe you think this is the year Winnipeg is finally going to go beyond a couple of rounds. I'm kind of feeling like maybe, just maybe, if the Jets make it through the first and second rounds, there could be a really deep playoff run in store. Because if you look at it, right, the Central is the hardest division in this league. The Jets are in second in that division, and they have embarrassed the two best teams in that division within the past couple of days. So maybe, just maybe, this season feels a little bit different. But no matter what, I want to encourage new customers to join FanDuel because you can get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 win or lose. Bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all on an app that's safe, secure, and easy to use. What are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic victory. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Greetings, Winnipeg Jets fans, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for joining us on tonight's episode as we are just talking about some interesting stuff from Winnipeg's recent turn in form. Big 7-game winning streak. Things finally feeling like the team has kind of turned it around for the better. Maybe you can call it a switch being flipped. Maybe you can just call it the team not sucking anymore. I don't know. I think you could pretty much argue anything, and I don't really care. The main thing is that the outcome has looked pretty good, and the process is kind of matching up with the outcome. So, you're feeling like the Jets are actually winning the right way, which is a really critical distinguishing point from some of their previous years. Before we talk about whether or not the top line is powering this, just wanted to let a lot of you NFL fans know about Locked On's NFL Mock Draft, which is live on April 17th at 7 p.m. Eastern, streaming on Locked On Sports Today 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. You can find the ultimate 6-episode series on April 17th at 7 p.m. Eastern to hear who the Locked On experts are picking for every NFL franchise, with live reactions from our local college experts and even the fantasy football angle. The Locked On NFL Mock Draft on April 17th at 7 p.m. Eastern, streaming live on Locked On Sports Today 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Now, like I said, obviously the top line for the Jets recently have started to at least be break even, right? I think that was really my central concern about Connor Scheifele and Velarde playing together, is that when they used to have shifts, they generally got submarined, right? The defensive side of their game was so bad and so non-existent, I guess you could say, that they basically spent almost every single shift pinned in front of Hellebuyck. And that led to a lot of goals against. It led to a lack of offense because they had to spend so much time just trying to get out of their own end. And it really stifled the creativity of each of those players individually because all three of them are immensely skilled. But when they get played together, traditionally, it has not been all that fantastic. Recently, though, I don't know what changed, but it feels like Connor has been super engaged. Scheifele has generally looked up for it, even though he only started scoring some points recently. And Velarde has generally looked a little more capable playing on that right wing spot as that trio has spent more offensive zone time, right? When they're like playing together on the power play, they are dynamite together. But when they're at even strength, it has usually been a bit of an uphill battle. But recently, they've been at break even or better. And I think in those games like tonight where they generally looked pretty good. I don't know if their total expected goal contributions were at or above 50%, expected goal share, but I mean, whatever, right? I think the main thing was that, generally speaking, especially in the first half of the game, they were really cooking together. They were setting up some really dangerous plays. There were some good goals coming out of it. They just looked like they finally had found some of the chemistry that we've been begging from them for, most of the year. Because we know that Bones is going to be really stubborn about who he gets paired with who in this lineup, especially the top six. And so it's kind of incumbent on the players to step up and really rise to the occasion. And I feel like this line has done a good job of that, which is a lot for me to say that because you know how much it really pisses me off that they broke up Ehlers, Scheifele, and Velarde. That trio was amazing. And obviously, like I said, even on their bad games, they still generally drove shot share, which I think is a big deal. And, for the new top line to kind of go back to doing some decent things, I think is really good because, look, Bones isn't going to use Ehlers on the first line anymore. Barring some need for a spark, I think he's pretty convinced of who he wants in his specific spots. And the first line does still have a lot of defensive issues. Make no mistake. I think the Kraken pinned him in deep a couple of times, and they struggled to make, zone exits and clearances. But on the whole, right, past few games, I'd say I was pleased with, which is good, right? And it seems like they're starting to build some level of consistency. So as long as they're break even, I really don't care, because we know the rest of the team is good. The other three lines play really well together. So it's only a question of whether or not the top line gets buried. And so far, the answer is no. They've, since being reunited, I don't know if something lit a fire under their butts, but they've looked very different than they did earlier this year. Connor has looked super engaged. Scheifele has looked like he's up for it. Still some sloppy turnovers and bad passes, but for the most part, it's a lot more limited than it was earlier this year. So again, if you're talking about trying to make the best of a situation that's not ideal, I think this is probably how I would frame it, right? The Jets are perhaps putting themselves in a tougher spot, but so far it's not holding them back. And so long as the team continues to do what it's been doing the past several games, I don't really envision there being too many problems. Now, in a 7-game series, I'm curious to know if that holds up. Obviously, the Avs and the Stars and teams like that make really good late game adjustments. The only thing that, may prevent that from happening is if the Jets just completely neutralize all of their best traits, right? If you shut down their speed and skill, that makes it a lot harder for them to get up the ice. And if the Jets can, stop that transition game, that could be the key to controlling the game. But assuming that, that's not going to be the template that works for every single evening, I just want to make sure that the top line is still playing at a pretty decent level. It doesn't have to be perfect. I'm not asking for, a Monet or anything. I'm just asking for like a competent break-even performance where, the Jets, if they're going to concede on that line, at least they score this like a similar amount, right? I don't need perfection, but I want at least break-even play, and that makes the rest of it be pretty effective, I guess, so to speak. So yeah, like the top line, they've been doing well. I think it's nice to have a top line that's at least at 50% because everyone else has generally been well above that, right? Only a couple of games where the bottom sixes maybe struggled in a few opportunities, but for the most part, I really feel like the Jets are rolling 4 lines. It feels like everyone's getting some pretty good shifts out there, and the Jets are making the most of it so far. So a lot to like, a lot more impressive than some of the earlier season performances. And, you just hope that as we go into the playoffs, the Jets are able to continue this. But of course, Winnipeg is not the only team that's really fighting for a playoff spot and, playoff seeding. We've had a very, very crazy, wild card chase out west, or out east, right? Which, if you're a Jets fan, you know how it is in the West. It's always a bit of a bloodbath. The Eastern Conference wild card this year has kind of felt like nobody wanted the second spot. I can't even begin to describe what that race was even like, other than just teams kind of stumbling into the playoffs. If you can think about our NFL brethren in the Jets, it's like the Mark Sanchez butt fumble, but somehow that team made the playoffs, right? That's sort of what we're talking about here, where not necessarily that specific Jets, right? But just imagine like a team like the Mark Sanchez butt fumbling Jets making the postseason. I don't even remember if they made the playoffs that year, but that's kind of what it feels like. All the teams fighting for the final wild card were like this year. It just seems like it was a complete mess, and honestly, most of them were kind of bad. And guess who made it? The Washington Capitals. We'll talk about how that all broke down and why the Eastern wildcard race continues to be one of the most amusing in the whole league in just a little bit. Before we go too much further, though, I do want to shout out our friends and partners at Sleeper. We are almost at the end of the season, and obviously the Jets are ready for home ice in the first round. It's going to be a very exciting time. I'm sure you've all got your whiteout gear. Honestly, post some photos or something. I don't know how you would do that on YouTube, but obviously send me your photos on Twitter or whatever. But regardless of where the Jets are in the current standings, I want to remind you that you could win big by playing daily fantasy hockey on Sleeper, the official daily fantasy app of the Locked On NHL Network. Sleeper is our number one choice because you can win 100 times your cash in daily fantasy hockey contests. For those of you who are stats nerds super fresh to know the game at an intimate level, this is your chance to put your money where your mouth is, because if you can project who's going to do well on a given night, maybe you can beat Sleeper's projections, whether it's more or less than what they predict for a given game. You could actually start to win big, right? Whether it's Crosby, Ovechkin, McDavid, Hellebuck, all the big stars of the game, they track all those stats, and you can win big because if you get 8 projections for a given game correct, guess what? You win 100 times your bet. That's 8 correct predictions for a given game, and that's 100 times your bet with Sleeper. So start paying attention and nail your picks so you can start winning big. Use promo code LOCKEDONNHL and you'll get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. That's code LOCKEDONNHL. See Sleeper's terms of use for details and locational availability. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just closing out really quickly with some thoughts on what has been one of the wildest playoff races in the whole league. It's also been one of the stupidest because if you look at the teams that have been fighting for the second wildcard race or wildcard spot, How many of them are actually good? I'll give you a hint. Almost none of them. You had a four-way race between the Flyers, Penguins, Red Wings, and Capitals, and somehow the Caps, with a minus 37 goal differential, took the final spot, which is really funny because like no other team or like no other division has had teams with negative goal differentials making the playoffs. The Metro almost had 2 to 3 teams. You have the Isles with a minus 18, the Caps with a minus 37, and the Flyers with a minus 26. Man, the Metro is just a trash division this year. You've got the Rangers, who are like winning the President's Trophy somehow. You've got the Canes, who are still pretty dang good, but perhaps one of those teams that you expect to sort of flame out in the playoffs, because it seems like that's always the case. But I just don't even understand what was going on in the second wild card spot. What's kind of funny is like the Lightning just sort of wrapped up the first wild card spot, and no one really seems to be paying that much attention to them. The Atlantic is obviously a much, much, much better division. You've got a couple of teams at the top of that division that look like they're fighting for a Stanley Cup. And then you've got the Metro that's like 2 strong teams and then everyone else. But wow, the way that the Caps actually clinched the playoff spot, I can't even believe this happened. But the Red Wings had forced overtime against the Montreal Canadiens, and that meant that their season was still alive, right? Because they got a point out of that, the Flyers were actually eliminated at that point, but they didn't know it. And nobody told Torts that the Red Wings had forced overtime. And so he thought that a regulation win would get the job done against Washington. It was kind of a win and you're in sort of thing for both teams. Less so the Flyers and more so the Caps, but they pulled the goalie with 3 minutes left. Washington, of course, scored the empty net. And no one told the Flyers that actually didn't matter. So they basically eliminated both the Penguins and the Red Wings with that whole situation. I've never seen anything like that before. I can't even imagine what the Red Wings and Penguins are feeling right now. That is one of the weirdest decisions I've ever seen. Pretty wild that no one told them they were already out of the postseason on the Flyers bench at that point. So fascinating, very interesting decision making going on in that. But like you compare that with the Western wildcard race, and it's been actually really, really intense and really competitive. You've got perhaps the Kings sliding back into the second wildcard spot, pending how the Knights finish their season. You've got the Preds, who have been on a ridiculous run of form recently. One of the real big surprises of this season, I would say, I don't think anyone thought Nashville was going to be in a playoff spot the way that they are, especially playing quality hockey. This team under Burnett has been a huge surprise, and I kind of feel like whoever gets them in the playoffs, which I think at this point is going to be the Canucks, a first-round series against Nashville really feels like a trap, right? I know the Canucks are a very strong team. They have had a really phenomenal year, but I feel like Nashville is one of those teams that I do not want to face in the playoffs. Vancouver is probably a little wary of the series. I think it's going to be really tough, and it should be very entertaining because I feel like the Preds have all of the hallmarks of a team that's going to play spoiler in the postseason. You've also got some interesting playoff series shaping up. Obviously, we have Winnipeg versus Colorado in round 1, and awesome for the Jets to clinch home ice advantage. Dallas versus perhaps Vegas or LA. I think the Stars should definitely be favored whoever they're playing. But the Stars are one of those teams where, if you can kind of take advantage of that neutral zone and sort of shut them down the way the Jets did, you take away a lot of their threat. But I think most teams have had really big trouble doing that. Just look at the Jets. They've only beaten them once this year, right? So should be a very competitive series. I'm very curious to know who finishes in third in the Pacific because, an Edmonton and Vegas series could be one of the most exciting of the whole playoffs. I know the Knights are not as good as they were in previous years, but they still play a very pesky style. They're still very fun. And with the Oilers and Knights both being a little bit unpredictable in net, I think that could make for a super entertaining series. Out in the East, you've got Boston and Toronto again. That should be something, man. I'll tell you. The Bruins and Leafs going at it for another playoff series with the Bruins having home ice advantage. You just can't author this kind of stuff. That's a sort of first-round drama and all the emotions that get associated with it that just make for an absolute blast. And then you've got the battle of the two Florida teams, Panthers versus Lightning. That should be awesome. Actually, I think the Panthers may be facing the Caps. I think I'm mistaken. Um, I may be mistaken about that. Yeah, looking at the standings, because I think the Rangers are going to face. Oh no, sorry, it is the Panthers versus the Lightning. It's the Florida series, because the Rangers are going to be facing the Caps. Yeah, the Rangers versus Caps. I don't even know what to say about that series. The Caps are pretty bad, generally speaking, but Charlie Lindgren has come into their season and basically turned their whole year around. So maybe they can play spoiler, but I feel like the Rangers are pretty heavily favored. I would think Shesterkin pulls this one out, and that the strong Rangers squad that's got a lot of firepower should pretty easily take the series in 5 or 6 games. Canes, Isles, I don't even really care about. I mean, the Isles are not very good. The Canes are very good. I think it's a pretty one-sided series. I don't think Sorokin can kind of mask just how bad the Isles have been, but maybe I'm surprised, and maybe the Canes flame out once again. But I'd be curious to know what playoff series you're going to be following. Are you really excited about all of the funny storylines out of the East? Are you more interested in what's going to happen in the West? Because I feel like every Central team has an absolute nightmare of a matchup to get through. More so in the Central Division. The Pacific Division, the matchups are really tough, but perhaps not to the degree that you've got like 3 cup contenders all in the Central, right? That is a crazy stacked group of teams in Dallas, Winnipeg, and Colorado. Imagine like that King Ghidorah meme with like the 3 heads and the one's the goofy one. Yeah, the Central doesn't have that goofy head. It's just all 3 monsters, and they're all fantastic teams in their own right. They've all had a great run of form for the most part, except for the Avs. And yeah, should be a very fun playoff run. But of course, it will start next week. We'll probably do some playoff preview coverage later this week and talk about some of the end of season wrap up stuff. Obviously, the Jets still have their game against Vancouver. One final thing probably worth shouting out is that Rocket McGroarty is going back to Michigan for one more year, so he's not going to be making his playoff debut or anything like that, which is fine. I think if he goes back to college for one more season, he's going to have time to kind of think it over. He'll come back to a team that's going to have more roster spots, I think, after next season. Obviously, you know, I think this year there wasn't really a role for him. I mean, look who we're scratching: Cole Perfetti, Kupari, Gustafson. I mean, all of these guys are really great players, and all of them are riding pines. So where would McGroarty have gotten in? Nowhere. And I think he probably recognized that, but, you know, he's got plenty of time to sort of keep honing his craft, keep leading Michigan on, and I guess they'll try for another Frozen Four championship, so we'll see how that goes. But I'd be curious to know what you're excited about for the playoffs. Are you going to game 1? Are you trying to get to any of the games? Let me know in the comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets on Twitter. For tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for hanging out with us and listening to us tonight. We will see you back here tomorrow with a preview of Winnipeg versus Vancouver and perhaps some end-of-season wrap-ups. But like I said, it's all the time that we got for today. Thanks for listening. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets, go.